iHeartRadio presents Podversations, a weekly discussion with the biggest names and influencers in podcasting.
Hello and welcome to another conversation as part of our iHeartPodcast speaker series. I'm Will Pearson, president of iHeartPodcast. Every week we like to get together with one of our favorite creators, podcasters, producers, and talk about what's going on with a new show, with an existing show, and what's going on in the industry. And I'm really excited about today's conversation. Our guest is coming all the way from Sydney, Australia today. So this is a first for us. I think maybe the longest distance conversation we've had. Super excited about this. As I think many of you know, we have had a huge push, a very real focus on mental health in podcasting and really trying to bring on podcasts that help serve the needs and give tools to all different audiences as we think about the different kinds of shows that we want to launch and bring into the network. Today's conversation is about a show that actually launched and existed before coming onto the iHeartPodcast network. And we were so impressed with the work that this creator was doing that we knew we had to bring it on board and find a way to help the show continue to grow. Created by none other than Jemma Sbeg, who is a psychology graduate, mental health advocate living in Sydney, Australia. In 2021, launched this podcast called The Psychology of Your 20s. It's a phenomenal podcast that helps focus on so many different topics that are relevant to those in their 20s. Everything from imposter syndrome to the myth of the dream job to friendship breakups, you name it. If it's relevant to that audience, it will be discussed in this podcast. But Jemma, thanks and welcome, and thanks for spending some time with us.
No worries at all. Thanks, Will, for the lovely introduction as well. I can't believe I'm the longest distance conversation you've ever had, all the way from tropical Australia. So
I mean, yeah, it's hard to get a whole lot further. We haven't had an astronaut on yet, so we'll see. We'll see if we can. But it's lovely to chat with you. Super excited about this podcast. I want to go back to the beginning, if you don't mind, Jemma, and just hear a little bit about how you decided to start this podcast, a little bit about your background. Do you mind jumping in from there and just sort of telling us how this all came about?
Yeah, absolutely. So I started it back in 2021. I was still at university at the time, and I was having all of these incredible conversations with my friends, all of us in our 20s, going through a variety of different experience and events. And as you do, you sit down with your girlfriends and you have a bit of a rant about someone who's, broken your heart, or how you're super stressed about graduate jobs, even things from like your childhood that you're really only coming to terms with. And what I found was there was all of this theory, I was learning all of this literature that could really explain exactly what we were going through, and it was so applicable. But because it was so wrapped up in academic jargon and not very accessible to people who weren't studying psychology, it really wasn't getting applied. And that's where kind of the idea for the show came from. I was like, the psychology of your 20s, how come no one's done this before? And then I was like, oh wait, I probably need to do this. Like this is probably what I need to do. So it had very humble beginnings. I will say that if you go back and listen to some of the old episodes, you can tell that I'm like recording in the back of my car. I have like my best friends on, and now I'm obviously having very well-known people come on as guests. But I love to remember the time when it was really just a hobby, and before it kind of took off.
Well, I think that there's actually something really lovely about that. And there's a charm to great podcasts, because even as the podcast has matured and sort of developed and has become more polished in its presentation, I think a great podcast at its core still maintains that element of, I don't know, it doesn't feel too polished. At some level, you really want it to feel like a real conversation, and like a conversation that you're sort of able to sit in on, even if it's between two other people. Do you think about that as the podcast grows? Like, I'm guessing you don't want it to be, too fine-tuned or too polished. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I feel like you just peered inside my head and looked at my biggest insecurity right now.
Really? How
My
so?
goodness. Well, I think it's one of those things, as you put more effort into it, as you get better equipment, as you have more opportunities, it does get better, but sometimes I worry that that it will lose its authenticity. I don't think that's ever going to happen because it is really the stuff that's going on in my life, and I think that's like the secret ingredient. But sometimes I do worry. I'm like, oh, this is what I'm going through right now, but now I have all of these listeners. What if they're not going through this as well? And they don't want to listen to it. And then I always stop myself and I'm like, no, like this is ridiculous. This is what I've been doing for this whole time. And every time I've had that fear, the episode has ended up being one of the best ones that I've ever done. So I think because I think it's tapping into vulnerability, right? Is when you're most vulnerable about something, that's when people can feel they most relate. So yeah, but it is a good question. Sometimes I do worry about that, but so far it hasn't happened.
You haven't lost it at all. No, and not in that sense. There's actually something really interesting, I think, about podcasts that, through their title or through their approach may be for a specific audience, but can also feel very relatable to those outside of that audience. I think, I mentioned at the top here, we really try to create podcasts that are not one size fits all. They think about different audiences. You're probably familiar with the show Therapy for Black Girls with Dr. Joy,
I
which
love
is just
that.
it's a brilliant podcast, and she does such a fabulous job. But you can still relate to it if you're not necessarily a member of the community that it's originally intended for. The same thing with your podcast. As if you can't tell, I'm nowhere near my 20s, but I still find it a very relatable and fantastic podcast. When you're creating the show, are you thinking about the audience, or are you thinking more, you know what, I'm going to talk about things that feel relevant to me and my friends, and I hope they just end up feeling relevant to others?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I do think about the audience, and I do take a lot of suggestions as well. Like some of my favorite episodes have come from suggestions from people. So like this week's episode was perfectionism and academic anxiety. So one part of that topic is not something that I'm dealing with any longer. I'm not at uni anymore. I'm not at college. But I am a big perfectionist. So it's about kind of being, and the idea of academic anxiety came from someone suggesting it on Instagram. And I was like, okay, yeah, I need to do this because sometimes I do think I can be too focused on the stage I'm in my 20s right now, forgetting that there was this whole period before this and there will be this whole period after this that doesn't really need to be accounted for, but I should be thinking about. But I found that I can think about the audience, but sometimes I'm surprised by who my audience is. I got like a review the other day, and it was like, life in my 40s, not in my 20s. I'm obsessed with this podcast. Or people who are like, I got my favorite of DMs from parents who are like, I have someone in their 20s, like a daughter or a son, or a child in their 20s, and I don't know what they're going through. So I've been listening to your show to get a good grasp. That was especially the response for the episode I did on the complete guide to therapy in your 20s.
Right.
A lot of parents listened to that one and were like, oh, thank you. Like I needed to know how to get my child into this. So
yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah, it was that we had sort of a funny moment related to another podcast where my wife and I were talking to the therapist for one of our kids and just doing sort of a general catch up, and she made reference to a series. She said, if you want to peek into the mind of a teenager, there's this great new series that's put out by this brilliant professor at Yale, a woman named Dr. Laurie Santos. And I didn't reveal that, she's obviously one of our podcasters with the Happiness Lab, and it's brilliant. But
yeah,
but it is fun to sort of listen and understand those kinds of things as we create this. I'm curious for you, have there been certain lessons or takeaways or themes of episodes that, for you more recently, you've thought, oh, I'm gonna use that in my own life. I haven't thought of that before.
oh my goodness, that's great questions you've got going on here. Yeah, actually, I think the beautiful thing about this job and this podcast is that every week I get to learn something new. A lot of it is prior knowledge that I have, but I like to get different articles and different kind of research and really make sure that it's evidence-based, because I think there's a lot of self-help podcasts out there that it's just opinions, which is still really valuable, but sometimes I think we do need a bit more of that literature to back it up. And it was on my episode, Taking Risks in Your 20s. And well, this was right before I think right as I was making the decision to join iHeart and to quit my full-time job. And there was a study that was done that said they surveyed all these participants, and they were faced with a decision. And those who did not make that decision experienced much more regret than those who did. So it was this real motivator being like, you are more likely to regret a decision that you don't make than one that you do, according to this research. And I was like, all right, okay.
Going
and
for
I think
it.
the next day I quit my job and I put in my 4 weeks notice. So
Wow.
and like that may not be relatable to everyone, but I do think that study is relatable to everyone.
Yeah.
There's risks inherent in life, right? So
Right. Yeah, we might not be suggesting everybody quit their day jobs right now and start a
no.
podcast immediately, but yes, I love the takeaway. And I was actually going to ask you about that because obviously you did leave your job to focus on this podcast. Now, I think you were smart enough to see this podcast to a certain level of success, which, by the way, I don't know that you even fully appreciate. I think I've mentioned this to you before, how rare it is for an independent podcaster to start a podcast and grow it on their own to almost 1 million downloads a month. I mean, it's phenomenal. It sort of speaks to the passion that you put behind it and the need for it as well. Like, it truly is phenomenal. But that transition for you of going from a day job to now focusing on this full time, what has it been like since you made the decision?
Also, thank you. I don't think I do fully appreciate it. So it's weird when I feel awkward when people tell me how
I'll
many
say it
people
again
have
then if you don't mind.
listened.
No, go ahead.
I was like, turn off the camera. I think the transition, my episode coming out this week is on the transition. So I'm going to spoil it for everyone listening to this, a little sneak peek. But I think it was both scary and incredibly fulfilling. I think I had for a long time been a bit disillusioned in my 9 to 5, and I just wanted to make the podcast 24/7. And that sounds like a good thing until you have limited hours in your day and you're staying up till like 12 or 1 a.m. because you just like really want to get the episode out. And I think it was a genuine love for the content, and it still is there. So that was like kind of creating not a great work-life balance. And now I've actually eliminated the thing that was taking up the most time, which was my job. And it's just allowed for so much more creative freedom. It's allowed me to really think more and really dive deeper, to be able to do more guest episodes, because now my hours when people would normally want to record are free. And I'm not suggesting go out and quit your 9 to 5. I think also I put a lot in place to make sure that I could do that. And it was a long-term goal that I managed to get, that I was really like focused on and putting in place like certain things to make sure that this would eventually be possible, even if the podcast wasn't successful. So
Yeah.
it's
Well, that's
an
terrific.
exciting time.
Exactly. So what's your take on podcasting as a medium to accomplish what you're trying to accomplish? Like, what have you found to be unique about podcasting as opposed to, maybe video only, or as opposed to books or any other medium that might be out there?
So I think that podcasting is like this weird intersection between like music and video content.
Mm-hmm.
In that when you have a video, it's almost like having video content, but you're not watching the video, right? Like it's just that it doesn't have that visual stimulation. But I think what that means is that you can carry it around in your pocket. You don't have to be staring at your screen. You can listen to it at work. You can listen to it on a walk. You can listen to it on the train whilst you're doing other things without having to be visually engaged, but still mentally engaged. And for my mission in particular, like I really want to make the concepts of psychology more accessible and get people thinking about their mental health in a different way before it reaches a crisis point. That's like the best medium for this. It's the best medium because it's almost like therapy. It's talking therapy, but they're not really talking. But it's like they're able to engage in this conversation that either I'm having with someone else or that I'm having with them. And I do try and make it really personal so that every single person who's listening feels like I'm not talking to this big amalgamation of people I don't know, but I'm talking specifically to them in those conversations that I'm having, because that's how I make the most impact, I think, by making you feel part of a community, but also that we're just sitting down and having a chat. And the response I get from that is so profound, because the amount of comments and DMs I get of people being like, it felt like I can't afford therapy right now, but I wanted to know and I wanted to learn about these parts of myself. So thank you for providing that to me. Or people who are like, I was in tears, or this feels like having a conversation with an older sister or with a therapist, but it's just me and them. So I just think that's the real power of audio. And since I was a kid also, like, I've loved podcasts. My mum used to play This American Life for me when I was like 3 years old in the back of the car. So I think that's always been the medium that I've really related to the most, as a bit of a podcast stan from day dot.
Oh, I love hearing that. That's pretty terrific. Well, before I let you go, I'd love to hear about your thoughts on the future of the show. You know, you're obviously still just a couple of years into it, not quite actually, and would love to hear, you know, where you want it to go, what you want to be doing with it, you know, as you think down the line.
Yeah, I think honestly, I want to keep the main core of it very much the same, like that authenticity. But I want to expand the things on the outskirts, right? The things that just add flavor to that authenticity. So bringing on more guests, particularly those with really incredible stories. I would love to do video content at some point. And also just dive a bit more into like the therapy concepts at some stage, and maybe do a series on that, of understanding this condition or understanding this therapy method or something like that, and just seeing what the future holds.
Yeah, well, I love it. It's off to a fantastic start. We are thrilled to be partners with you in trying to bring this to a broader audience. But for all those watching, listening, if you haven't already checked it out, The Psychology of Your 20s, it's a fantastic podcast. I love what it brings into the space. And as Jemma mentioned before, you know, there are so many people looking for resources that they may not be able to have access to otherwise. And also for those that do have access to certain tools, there's always a desire for more as we think about being able to better our own mental health. But Jemma, thanks so much for spending time with us today.
You are so welcome, Will. Thanks for your great questions. I'm so excited to be with iHeart. It's like the most exciting new chapter. So thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And thanks everybody for tuning in. We will see you again next week.
Podversations is a production of iHeartRadio. You can find more from the biggest names in podcasting on the iHeartRadio app or wherever you get your podcasts.